And welcome back to our first of two lectures on water. Today we're going to be talking about pools and flows, we're going to be talking about resources, and we're going to be talking about our local water system here in New York City. Starting in this case at the New Croton Dam, we'll find there's a lot of places that it comes from. Nevertheless, before we do that, let's talk a little bit about some housekeeping. First off, as the class is now online, all of our quizzes will take course over the course of a week, meaning that you can do them or complete them at your will. They will have a 1-week timeline from the day it would have been assigned, Monday, to that next Monday. So know that it's kind of more now like a homework assignment. It'll generally consist of short answers in response to a presentation or a text that I supply you. We'll talk a little bit later about our quiz for today. We're also going to always have resources we can use to look at different media throughout the rest of this course. Obviously, we'll be using a lot of internet resources. Here I would advise you guys look at Water and Earth Resources in the New York Times short video about how we go through 1 billion gallons a day of water here in New York City. And then as we get through the other topics, you'll see some other suggested media if you're looking for something to watch or read. So I also wanted to talk just briefly about the second exam. I've finished grading them. The average is around an 87, and I'll be putting them into the online gradebook shortly. I just wanted to go through some of the questions that stood out as either well answered or that proved to be difficult for certain people. And so let's go page by page, just sort of briefly. Know that issues that you guys had with certain questions may well pop up on the final, which we'll discuss in a couple weeks. So let's look first at alternative food systems. Most people did pretty well on identifying both an environmental and ethical reason why people would choose not to eat meat, talking about, say, the treatment of animals, or also, of course, the environmental impacts, say, of methane that's produced by cows, for example. With regards to how we can promote meatless options and diets, people were really on both sides. Some people felt it was necessary to reach out and be not necessarily aggressive, but outward, whereas many felt it was more of a personal issue. So know that you may well want to sort of address the individual when looking at ways to promote meatless options and diets rather than, say, one broad technique. Lastly, in terms of better connecting with farmers, when we talk about across the country, one goal would be to actually go and visit, right? Just learn to explore these other areas. But when it comes to more local, right, a great option would be something like a farmer's market, or even just learning more online about different programs that they may partake in or ways to interact with them. So now looking at non-renewable energy, most people did a good job of talking about, say, fracking oil, or shale gas, I guess you could also say, or mining coal. So that was how you would get it out of the earth. Generally, it will be used in that either solid, liquid, or gaseous form, though oil is going to be distilled or essentially refined into a variety of different things like diesel and gasoline. On top of that, environmental impacts are wide-ranging. We're going to talk about, say, the emissions of CO2, a variety of other things that might be in coal and oil. That could be lead if it's not taken out, sulfur, or perhaps nitrogen that comes from the air when you combust to form things like SOx and NOx. And that's a pretty good answer for number 4. Number 5, as we've been talking about, the sun is always going to be what powers all of these cycles. We'll see today how it powers the water cycle as well. In this case, it will allow for all the plants to grow to form biomass, which will then become oil and gas, along with coal. And on top of that, it even essentially helped create some of the nuclear fuels that we could use. Not that we were talking those specifically here. So for a couple years now, in regards to number 6, I've been able to have some of my power be offset by wind energy. This was actually both back in Kansas, where most of it's probably generated, but now Con Ed actually in Westchester is allowing you to do that as well. You pay a slightly higher portion. So we could see that that might prevent the need for, say, burning coal or also oil. But it really depends on where you are. I know solar is becoming a much more popular option as well. I have a friend who just started a solar construction job, and so it's nice to see those going up. That could help prevent, say, the need to be connected to the grid at large as well. As we move on to renewable energy, let's talk a little bit about biomass. So biomass here could literally be defined as biological matter. If you wanted to, you could probably burn most living things. I would hope that you wouldn't. We're looking more at burning things like trash and waste, and things that have been also refined into either oils or ethanol, things like biodiesel. So to define biomass, we've done that. Let's identify one example like bioethanol. That's going to generally come from carbohydrates, places like corn. And then one non-renewable energy it may easily replace. Well, we already are using ethanol as a replacement for components of gasoline, and so you could imagine perhaps creating an engine that runs entirely on that. When it comes to nuclear energy, though it doesn't say put a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're still going to consider it non-renewable, in part because it's not renewable on human timescales. So while we are able to, say, mine more elements that are radioactive to use in different nuclear facilities, we won't be able to regenerate those, and the waste will last a really long time. So one thing we're going to find is that even though if you could live for millions and billions of years, nuclear power would be considered renewable, we are going to keep considering it non-renewable in these instances. And so last but not least, talking a little bit about hydroelectric, which will become a theme for today, you could look at, say, not only the cost of materials and time that go into creating the physical dam or setup that you need to process that moving water, but we're also going to find that generally when you begin to turn a flow like a river into a pool like a lake, through a dam, for example, it's going to have a lot of consequences on the environment around you. People, animals are going to need to move, the landscape is going to change, and so you need to make sure that you don't disrupt, say, that ecosystem too much. Similarly, when you dam a river, things aren't going to be able to flow down past that river generally. Sediment may build up, and so you need to be careful about the different ways that you attack or access water power. Last but not least, not only my favorite unit, but definitely the one you guys didn't do the best on, the atmosphere. So we talked about how 99% of air in the stratosphere is in the stratosphere or troposphere. And so what are the three major components, right? We know, again, primarily we're going to be looking at nitrogen, so N2. We're going to be looking at what we breathe, which is oxygen or O2. And then we'll find that carbon dioxide is going to be one of the other major components. We had a minor list of components as well, but here we're going to be looking at the things that are most relevant for our class at least. To talk about how ozone is different in the stratosphere and the troposphere. So we can see here the troposphere is at the bottom, and this is generally going to be where ozone is a pollutant. So it's going to be released by human activity, things like photocopiers perhaps, or essentially electrical interactions with oxygen as well. And we're going to find that it helps create things like photochemical smog. Whereas up in the stratosphere, it actually is a part of our ozone layer and is quite beneficial in blocking those UV rays from reaching us. And so it sort of acts like a way to absorb radiation, like CO2, but it is inherently different in that they're both pollutants down, well, definitely down at ground level. Lastly, we talked about how there is a temperature inversion between the troposphere and the stratosphere, right? It starts at generally around room temperature down where we are at ground level and begins to decrease up until you hit the stratosphere where it will begin to increase. And it's this change in temperature or this inversion over space or over distance that's going to sort of trap a lot of these clouds and most weather into the troposphere where we essentially live and breathe and spend most of our lives. So that's just a quick run through of this past exam. If you have specific questions, of course, email me once I put my grades up for you guys. You are always welcome to reach out and ask questions as to why you got what you got. Otherwise, not such a bad exam. Expect to see some of these questions on the final as well, but we'll get there in due time. Today, we're going to look at exploring the New York watershed, so where the water comes from that we drink and how it gets to us in New York City. We'll talk about pools and flows, and we will finally explore the water cycle, the one that we missed up until this point. I would like to point out that on the second midterm, a lot of people contributed or attributed the hydrogen cycle to a lot of the things relating to food and agriculture. We will find that the water cycle is a better way to kind of represent the flow of the hydrogen that we're interested in. So know that if you're thinking about either oxygen or water or hydrogen, you're going to want to talk about the water cycle in the rest of your answers for our quizzes. So it's no surprise that we're going to start today by making lists of our pools and our flows and seeing how they connect, and then we'll begin to judge the things next class as to how we can improve them. So let's start off a little bit by talking about the differences between pools and flows with regards to water. It's relatively easy because we can think about a lot of different sort of scales of pools and flows with different water features. For example, the ocean and rivers being the biggest and also perhaps the most distinctive between, say, a flowing river and sort of a standing body of water, like an ocean, though we know there are lots of changes throughout an ocean and even perhaps a large enough river. So let's look at some of the differences between the smaller water features that we encounter, also around here in New York State. Let's start by talking about the differences between, say, a lake and a pond. So this again is going to come down to scale, but we'll see there are some impacts as well in terms of what goes on in these different types of pools. And so we'll start with the lake, which is a body of water surrounded by land. We'll find the pond is actually the same. Lakes here are generally, though, expansive enough, as it says, to have both currents or waves. So there's sort of a scale, a mid-range scale. You probably don't own a lake unless you're very, very rich. Seemingly, lakes can also be a large water resource for many different states or even different countries. Compared to, say, a smaller body of water or a pond, we're going to find that these are still surrounded by land, but generally they're going to be still, which is to say there isn't much sort of difference between one point in the pond or another in terms of, say, a living species or perhaps the concentration of a pollutant, for example. And so one other thing we can find with lakes and ponds in terms of categorizing them is that lakes may be so large from top to bottom, not just left to right, that they actually have multiple temperature layers. This is going to be important in, say, the Great Lakes, for example, where you're going to have regions where very little changes chemically over a given period of time and things that change relatively rapidly with regards to access to the atmosphere and such. We'll find that different types of organisms exist in these situations, and they can thrive in different settings. And upsetting those can be a challenge. And we'll compare these to ponds, where in this case it's generally consistent in terms of temperature, and then probably most of what you can find, right? It's not pretty big top to bottom, hopefully big enough to walk in, for example. So let's go back to an image that we actually saw in our first couple days of class. We were talking about different pools of water, and in this case we're literally talking about, say, the distinction between an ocean or bodies of fresh water, water that we can drink, compared to, say, the very small fractions of water that are, say, underground and then even in rivers, which we think of probably when we think of water very quickly, compared to, say, maybe glaciers or ice caps. We may forget that they're there, and they are leaving us pretty quickly. But one thing we'll notice again is that more than 97% of all the water on Earth is going to be essentially not drinkable without treatment. The fresh water that makes up Earth is either going to be hidden in the ground, hidden in glaciers, trapped I should say, or in lakes where there's a variety of other things that depend on water. So it's not like we can just take it out. And so when we think of the surface water, so that it's accessible, we also think of what's drinkable. We can see that a variety of it is not really even accessible, right? We aren't going to literally drain a swamp for drinking water, though you could, I guess, do that and construct and things like that. We're going to want to be tapping things like rivers, which are replenishing year to year with our water cycle, which we'll come to explore. Nevertheless, right, so we're thinking about accessible water that's liquid, above ground, and drinkable, and we'll find that that's a very, very small portion of the total water on Earth. Also, we will remember that there is a total limit to the amount of water on Earth. It's not like water is coming or going from Earth at any time. So we need to be careful that we don't overextend in how much water we need or how much water we would like to need, if that makes sense as well. I thought that a good way to jump into the water cycle would actually be to take a step back and look at the carbon cycle. Something we'll find is that they are inherently intertwined, and kind of the big loop that you see here, which refers to carbon throughout Earth and its systems, is going to also pretty well apply to water as well. So let's look back. We can see, right, a variety of different types of carbon. It could be living, it could be in the ocean, it could be in the ground. And again, we just found that there were these patterns where it essentially flows through different pools, not only water pools in this case, could also be inorganic or living, and essentially gets regenerated over vast amounts of time, though little bits are being turned into all the other components as we go. And so what we'll do is we'll take these same ideas and even some of the pools and flows that we see here, like rivers and oceans, for example, and we will begin to construct what we know of as the water cycle. And something we'll find is that the pools of water aren't as relevant in terms of the chemicals that they come in. For example, here you might have carbon dioxide or you might have methane, two very distinct pools of elemental carbon. But with the water cycle, you're pretty much just going to have water in different places. So though it could be liquid, solid, or gas, like vapor or ice, we're going to find that it's more going to be about the verbs and the ways that it transforms or flows. And so we'll see some examples of this right now. So when we talk about the water cycle, I want you primarily to be thinking about different verbs often related to the weather and the way that water is transformed. So it might be something like precipitation, for example, thinking about rain, or even sometimes water just falling in the form of snow or I guess hail as well. On the other end, let's go from there. So when it begins to accumulate, it can also melt, so combine into liquid water or go into vapor as well. So we're going to have accumulation as our verb here. From here, essentially the water is going to begin to flow. So this could be due to things like runoff in rivers or channels. It's going to be intercepted and uptaken by different animals and plants, maybe even just soaked up into rocks. We're going to find that some of it will go down into the ground, into that essentially what's not surface water and what we can easily access, but what can be tapped as well. From there, it will collect into some of the ultimate pools on Earth, in this case our oceans. Before then, it's either again transformed into either water vapor and then rained out somewhere else, or again comes part of the cycle in just a different way. The big point to note is that evaporation is really what drives this cycle. And again, the heat from the sun is going to be what's driving evaporation. So essentially all of that energy out on those big open oceans. And so water is going to collect and form clouds and then begin to transport all over the Earth. And so we'll find, that there's still this big important element that is not technically water, but a big piece of this picture. And that's going to be our sun. So the great thing about water being the stuff of life is that it quite literally is universal. There is no person on Earth who has or ever will live that won't depend on water in some or many different ways. And so one of the great ways to connect different societies is through looking at the different ways they use water or how they're resourceful in how they use it. Here we have a list of some of the longest or most impressive rivers in the world, ones that you've probably studied in class and one that people from these countries where these rivers are would probably know. Looking at these different major rivers, we can see that every river is not only unique, but they're also a lot more complex than we might first think. And so what I thought we would do is look at our closest river, the Hudson River, and sort of explore some of the ways that it's unique. You will note that it is not actually on this part of our map. These are, as I said, the most impressive rivers, and the Hudson River is really on the other end of things. And so I thought, let us first explore a river in the United States that actually is rather impressive or large and impactful in terms of what goes on. So we'll look at the combined Missouri and Mississippi River, which technically would be two pieces, but can be combined based on how they connect to create a really long, vast flow for a lot of important water in the United States. One thing that's important to understand is that while we may often think of rivers as units, they really come collected and connected in how they create and sort of foster life on Earth. So here's an example of a variety of the different waters and thus their watersheds as well, essentially where the water is draining from into these rivers. And so we're going to have regions throughout the states, sort of like the individual states themselves, which are going to be collected based on where the water is flowing. And so we could imagine municipalities built up around these regions, or similarly even breaking up the states into large sections or portions based on where everything drains. You may notice this nice dark blue in the center, which is going to be in and around the Mississippi River, for example. And so let's take a second to look at a little bit more on the Mississippi. And so we've talked before about how the center of the country, essentially where the Great Plains and the Midwest are, was long ago a sea, and then the edges of that were going to be the mountains, the Appalachians, and also the Rockies. And so something we find is that once that drained out is we have this river system connected between places like the Missouri, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and what I have been told is called the Arkansas, but that was when I was in Kansas, so who knows if they're biased. But nevertheless, a variety of really important and powerful rivers that drain down into the Gulf of Mexico through Louisiana. And so something we find is, it's not really about just the Mississippi River, but the collection of rivers that help create it and come from it that essentially create really the life that would sustain a third of our country, if not more, right? Think of all the food that comes out of this region as well. And so just to give a shout out to the rivers that are somewhat between the scale of the Mississippi and the Hudson River, they include things like the Amazon River, the Nile River. We also have the Ganges, the Indus River Valley, right? Cradles of places where life began. The Danube River, the Columbia River, for example. What else do we have? We have the Rhine. And so places that are really a focus for industry and culture as well, beyond even just being a source of life and water. We often see water as a very important point when it comes to transport as well. This is a map which better shows you travel and transit through the Great Lakes, but you can sort of pick out, for example, also places like New York or Michigan or other states that essentially these lakes are built around. And so something we'll find is that having access to water is not just a question of having access to life, but also access to other life and transport and also trade. And so as we hone in on New York, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Erie Canal. This is a map of the Erie Canal. Psych, it's actually not. This is just a throughway map. But let's take a moment to look at the actual Erie Canal and see how similar it is. Something we'll find is that often roads are literally traveling in parallel or along with a variety of different rivers. So often you have to cross them to cross major roads, and that becomes a challenge, but also a great way to sort of have a connection between water and then this transit. So the Erie Canal was built in the early 1800s and essentially spans the entirety of New York State, but the important thing here is that it's going to connect the Hudson River and access to the ocean with the Great Lakes. And so we're going to find that this allows a lot of the sort of central north of America to flourish because of its access to, be it tools or resources, whatever you need, but also people who are going to be able to flow through there. Also, quick shout out to the Finger Lakes, which don't quite look impressive on a map, but are really beautiful and a great place to visit if you ever get a chance. Also, if you're looking for impressive water features in New York State, you really can't beat Niagara Falls. It is world class, to say the least. So I want to get into the meat of the lesson and talk a little bit about New York City's water supply. One thing we'll find is that it's comprised of and collected of a variety of different pools upstate. So these are going to be standing bodies of water that are going to be filtered naturally, and that's what gives New York its capability to essentially give water to so many people from so close. We'll find it comes through a variety of flows. These are going to be tunnels or tubes, even under the Hudson River, in this case to other watersheds, where it is then transported past Manhattan College to anyone who needs it. And so let's break this down just a little bit more. Something you'll note is that there are two major watershed areas that pull into New York City. The first is the Catskill, Delaware watershed. That's a little further north and was the second one built. Or the most recent one that was put together. We also have the Croton watershed, which is easily accessible by Metro North. You can actually walk in a straight line up some trails and paths to the new Croton Dam, which we saw at the beginning of the lecture. On top of that, then you sort of have the third region, which is going to be New York City and just north of it, where the water is going to be paused and then essentially sent in when it is needed or demanded. Looking at the map in more detail, we can see that the Catskill, Delaware watershed is actually comprised of a variety of other smaller reservoirs, some of which are relatively far apart, and others that are connected to actually other rivers, like the Delaware River. So something we'll find is that one of the things we're not going to be doing is taking water from the Hudson River. Though some of it is fresh water, we're also going to find that it is comprised of salt water as well. The Hudson River is an estuary of the connection between the ocean and further inland areas. And so we want to make sure that we're not taking in salt water to have to desalinate. That's a whole other issue that we'll come to. Nevertheless, we're going to find that it's a collection of these reservoirs that's going to flow through either, say, a Catskill aqueduct, all by gravity, which is what's going to allow this to be so cheap and affordable. So essentially, all of this water is going to be flowed south, essentially either parallel to or along the Hudson River, or even over to one of the other watersheds, the Croton watershed, the second stop, or I guess the first stop along the way down. And so something we'll find that this is also comprised of a lot of other little pools, right, or reservoirs. These are going to be places that you could maybe hike around or walk, but you generally wouldn't go into. You want to make sure that that is nice and clean. And one of the beautiful things, again, about these two watersheds, the Croton and the Catskill, Delaware, are that they are almost something like 90% naturally filtered. So whereas we might need to build filtration setups to process all of the water, only a portion of it needs to be filtered before it hits New York City, which makes it, again, not only more in line with environmental standards, you're not going to need to be using other chemicals or treatment methods, but we're also going to find that it helps protect and preserve these watersheds as well, because we don't need to sort of monitor them. Well, we monitor them quite a lot, but we don't need to alter them, at least in any way. And so as we make our way down, we can begin to see, for example, the new Croton Reservoir, where the dam that we saw at the beginning of the lecture was. And so we can begin to see that this is water that was pretty easily accessible probably in the 1800s, whereas as our sort of technology increases and reach increases, our watershed areas grow. One question I can always ask is, where do we think will become or need to become a watershed for New York City in the future? If we continue to grow in size and population, we would also need just as much water as well, if not even more. And so last but not least, we're going to move into sort of the second stop, I shouldn't keep saying that, which is going to be either a reservoir, for example, one paused exactly at the top of New York City, or it's going to be sent into the variety of different tubes and tunnels that we'll talk about in just a moment. Nevertheless, what we'll find is that it's going to essentially give water to all New York City residents, including places in Staten Island, via the tunnel we can see connecting the island in just a moment. But at the end of the day, we're going to find that it's one of the most reliable in the country. One of, I believe, only 5 which is naturally filtered as well, which is really neat that we're in this opportunistic spot to sort of take advantage of that as well. But I know that you're here for the good, so let's look at New York City specific water system and a little bit about what exists right outside of Manhattan College as well. So looking specifically at the aqueducts and the tunnels that are leading water into New York City, we can see that almost all of them come right by us in the Bronx, though they do separate out in our own different ways. So we have essentially the tunnels that are 1, 2, and the third is still being built. Here we can see the different stages of different tunnels related to this third tunnel that is actually the largest capital project for New York City, so essentially things that they're building. And it's no surprise that they're investing in water. It's going to be the most important asset regardless of where you are. Interestingly, one of New York's most important water features, in this case a set of valves, is going to be taking place really close to home. So this is from a great book that I have where it looks at different things all around New York City and primarily Manhattan, but also places like the Bronx. You can see what the High Line looked like back then. That was pretty a dated photo. Nevertheless, let's look in this instance at what is underneath Van Cortlandt Park. So you may be well familiar. There's a variety of different above ground things to explore, trails and water as well. Something that we find underneath is going to be, in this case, a set of valves to help with the third tunnel, which is originally constructed, started in 1970. It used the boring machine that dug the channel between France and the UK. And what we're going to see is this project is actually still going on. It was slated to finish at the end of this year. We'll see if it takes a little bit longer. It has taken, oh my gosh, almost 50 years so far, and is one of the most expensive construction projects, right, to make sure that New Yorkers have access to water. So if you ever go strolling around on that golf course, you may be able to think about deep below you is an expanse roughly the size of Yankee Stadium, which helps manage the flow of that water from those reservoirs up north down into the Bronx, and I believe also other parts of the city as well. So take a second to look at the water system that we have here, and take a second to look at what it looks like, for example, a subway system or a train system. Also take a moment to look at what's missing. Look at the large parts of Queens and Brooklyn that may be well fed by water in another area or another place, but nevertheless, how could we maybe better connect our city to make sure that water from, say, upstate New York also reaches parts of Queens, especially as they grow? Something you might do is sort of like if you've ever wondered why there isn't a subway line that goes from place A to place B, think about where we could have a better connection between water resources. For example, perhaps things directly west or maybe southwest somewhere in Jersey. My guess is you're going to need some sort of height, like a mountain up in the Catskills, to send that water flowing, but you never know. The best solutions probably haven't been seen yet. So let's take a moment to pause and think. We've talked about very large water systems or systems that serve large cities. What would a local water system look like? There may be cities without the infrastructure like New York. How might we benefit from, say, something a little more close to home? And also knowing that there are places that have that, what might that look like in New York? And so let's come back and talk a little bit about the different types of flows that we have. So we're pretty familiar with rivers at this point, but we can also see smaller features in order from the stream to the creek to the brook. These we probably think of more interchangeably. Nevertheless, a stream is probably something that you wouldn't necessarily choose to cross without, say, rain boots or perhaps a little bridge. While on the other end, something like Tibbetts Brook, which is near us in Manhattan College, is going to be small enough that you can probably hop over it or walk over it pretty quickly. So we're going to find essentially that the stream's the largest, the creek next, and then the brook. And we'll see an example of Tibbetts Brook in just a second. So let's talk about Tibbetts Brook just a little bit. Tibbetts Brook, which is not only close proximity to Manhattan College, but also very relevant historically to the area, begins up in Yonkers, as we can see essentially where the old aqueduct ended. and flows essentially through the park today as we know it, but through some other residential areas as well, essentially all the way down into the top of where Manhattan would hit the Bronx. And so, even though this has been covered up, one of the efforts at Manhattan College is to help with the community, actually what we call daylight it, which is to say bring it back to the surface so it can see the daylight or the sun, and essentially bring back this natural water resource, not only for environmental reasons, but for really, anything, for just to even have it be back to what it was. So, a great question that I'm sure you're thinking is, well, how would we actually daylight or bring a body of water back up to a certain level on ground? And so, for that, we need to talk a little bit about the water table. So, no, this is not a table literally made of water, but the premise here is that it is the placement at which you go from having a saturated ground filled with water, right, in between rocks or soil, to essentially above it where there might be dry space or more dry space. Now, of course, you can still have air trapped below and some water trapped above, but the premise here is that, right, we can see we go straight from that groundwater into the surface water. And so the point at which they meet is going to represent a point on the water table. And so something we'll find is that there is still going to be groundwater below ground level that we can't really see day to day. But if we were able to, say, dig a little deeper or provide the reinforcements for the water to sort of pool, we could essentially come up with something that can turn into a flow like a river. So we're going to find, right, that we want lots of living things on the banks to not only help suck up some of that water, but perhaps even pack it in from not flowing too far out. And we'll find that the types of rocks, for example, whether or not they're well-rounded or very jagged, are going to impact essentially how much water is stuck in between them and where that water level is. So we've talked a lot about natural forms of water and also the transport of water. So let's talk just a little bit about how humans use water. We can see here on the beautiful Delaware River, a nice hazy night. We can see at the far right a barn that was probably either a mill at one point and would have used, say, the power or flow of the water to essentially ground their grain, which they could then create food with and trade with, whatever it may be. So we're going to find that there's a lot of, again, industry or capital to be built up along these rivers. But of course, it always comes at the expense of the river in certain instances when we talk about pollution. And so we will next class begin to discuss not only treatment in terms of what we can do before we drink it, but then also what we do after we taint it. We'll also find that there are many practical uses to water. I'm sure you're one of those people who pulls over politely when an emergency vehicle goes by, or a fire truck, for example. I think you have to these days in New York State. Nevertheless, we're going to find that water has a good variety of uses beyond just keeping things living, right? Also protection. We're going to find that it's just a great way to transfer heat, so it's going to be a good fluid to regulate a lot of different industrial processes, also a lot of good chemistry as well. And nevertheless, you know this better than anyone. You every day use water for a variety of things. This could be related to hygiene. This could be related to cooking. You could be planting. But also there's a lot of other things in your life, as we'll discuss later on in this course, that essentially require water to be made. So let's take a second to look at how people use water sort of day by day. So these are going to be a little bit old averages, but that's still okay. We're going to find that, for example, agriculture uses quite a lot. Livestock, of course, require a lot of water. Also, what's known as aquaculture, which is going to be either growing perhaps fish, but also things like plants for consumption, or maybe even for feed for other things. Industrial is going to obviously use things, again, to balance heat and flow. You can think of nuclear reactors taking that water in from the river, not to do any chemistry with, but just to make sure that the heat is maintained in their facility. No surprise, it's needed in mining and also generating power, right? So in this case, you're going to use a lot of water to either generate steam or also turn turbines, all these sorts of things which are going to require a large amount of water as well. And so we can see, if we look at some of the numbers here, that the public supply of water, this sort of purplish color, is in much smaller amount than, say, not only power generation, but even just irrigation for agriculture. And so while it is important that you conserve water, you can see that the biggest impact that may be had will be by large-scale processes becoming more efficient. And so that's why we need all the engineers and also all of these people looking at how to make things essentially consume less water. So now that we're midway through the course, I want to begin to make topics a little bit more nuanced, not to say difficult, but just to add dimension to them. So now we're going to look at a flow and a pool that are kind of extreme versions of different types of flows and pools that you might have. And so we'll look specifically at currents within the ocean, right? So flows within a pool. And then we'll also look at sort of a permanent pool or a semi-permanent pool when we begin to think of ice. So within the ocean, which we think of as a pool, there are also going to be flows or currents, which we call rivers, underneath. And so essentially these could be a way to get heat or energy to transfer, but also living organisms throughout the sea. One of the worries about climate change is that if it were to change the temperatures within the ocean, it might affect these currents and thus the way that things travel across the sea. So just to talk for a moment about the importance of frozen water, something we find is that when water forms ice from liquid water, it can generally expel impurities, also could be things like salt. And so we're going to find that a lot of frozen water is particularly fresh and so drinkable. And so we want to make sure that these reserves are kept protected and not dissolved into the salty oceans or water. And so I'll leave you today with just a couple more images of water in different places and different spaces, and a couple of questions to think about as we move forward onto the next topic, which will take a look at water systems in the natural world and then how we put them into our kitchen sink. And so next class, what we're going to do is study the impacts of humanity on the water cycle and different water systems. Here's just a brief diagram showing how, say, a small facility not only takes in water, but also puts out water in different ways. This could be for use in terms of farming, could also be in terms of waste. And so we'll look again at two different impacts, how we treat water and how that impacts us and the water, and then also how pollution more generally impacts this. So, right, we've looked at air pollution, we've looked a little bit at other forms of waste in the coming classes, and so today, next class, I should say, we're also going to look at wastewater and treatment, which is again a specialty of Manhattan College, and so we'll look at our engineering departments for some help. And so to lead you out today, I wanted to sort of leave you with a couple questions to think about. Let's start with, where does all the water go? So you could think about this based on where you live. Know that Manhattan College is very interested in stormwater runoff because being on the sort of hill that we are with all those stairs, right, there could of course be trash washing away. So we need to think about some interesting solutions as to where the water goes. I would say actually that you can make a little flow diagram of the water that comes into your life every day and the water that goes out to see if that's balanced. Similarly, you could do that and then begin to look at how we can conserve water. So even though you're only a small slice of that pie, it's still going to be important, especially in moments like we're in right now, right, where people are using lots of resources. You want to be careful about not overusing. Lastly, start to think before we talk next week about the different types of pollution. Think again about the analogous forms. So we talked about sulfur in the air and nitrogen in the air. How might that impact, say, in water? And also, what is the connection between, say, pollution in the water, the air, and also the earth? And so we'll explore some of that next time as well. Okay, so until Thursday, there's a couple things you're going to want to do. Definitely going to want to come back for our second lecture. You're going to want to go online and respond to the student presentations and answer discussion questions. And also below this video in a link is going to be a New York Times billion gallons a day water interview. But I'll leave you with this. Enjoy. So last but not least, let's actually look at some of the things in Manhattan that are named for water. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the different streets and historically where their names come from. Many streets in New York have multiple names. In this case, we'll find that the most important relate to the most important water features as well with regards to Manhattan and New York City. So let's see one by one. Let's start one back. The first one I was able to find is the East River Drive. So no surprise, you may know it better as the FDR Drive. We're going to find that it's named after the river that it parallels, and so in this case it will be right along the East River, so one of the rivers that surrounds Manhattan. We will find something rather similar with our next one, which is the Harlem River Drive. So this is going to be along the Harlem River. It seems like each river that surrounds the city has its own wonderful piece of road. What I love about this was it was originally used for horse races, which New York had a lot of back then. I think we don't really have as much now. So the third in this example is going to be the Henry Hudson Parkway. So this is going to be named after the gentleman who, the first European to sail up the Hudson River, and the river was named after him. In this case, it was going to be essentially a way to go inland and go up to some of the other places that had been settled at this time. No surprise, right, that there were definitely names for these parts of Manhattan way before we named them, say, the Hudson or the river drives. They're going to be native names that we could also look to for important water features as well. There's a good book buried in the library that actually talks about the geography of Manhattan since even before it was settled by Europeans. Last but not least, let's look at a funny story related to downtown in Manhattan, close to where it was first settled. So in this case, Water Street, the namesake comes from the East River waters that washed at the street at high tide. And so this was so down to the water level, or the water table, you could imagine, that it was essentially covered at some times with water swirling around the foundations, and they wanted to build a retaining wall to help protect that. Eventually it was turned into a landfill, but we find that even from the very beginning, New Yorkers were always careful about the water at their feet, and also, I guess, the water, in this case, on their street. And so the only water-named features that we found for streets in Manhattan are those four, but we did have one other neat find in this book, which is going to be LaSalle Street, which is up in essentially Morningside Heights, a little bit below where what the old campus for Manhattan College was, named after, no surprise, the priest who founded the Christian Brothers, who was canonized in 1900, John Baptiste de LaSalle. And I will say it is also the location of the best restaurant in New York City. Pasticci is an Italian restaurant that is there, and it's really wonderful. And that's all we have today from the Street Book.